We screamed into space and heard the echo. Part 8. This is War. 2532, Alliance Camp, Felruin, UVR. Sue could move again. She stretched and flexed her limbs for no other reason other than knowing she could. Sue hadn't realized how trapped she felt being bodiless. Only after going through a whole routine of limbering exercises did she notice where she was, an oversized tent with important-looking people standing around the table in its center. Knights with various coats of arms and clergy with holy symbols, none of which she recognized. Her mood dampened as her roving gaze fell on one person. The one that all the others were deferring to. The Saintess Amy. Amy and Sue had likely arrived together, but while Sue had been stretching, Amy had taken charge, demanding reports of their situation. Then Sue glanced down and realized what she had been putting on display, far too much of her own skin. She didn't have a problem with the oversized pauldrons on her shoulders, or bulbous tassets on her hips, or the reflective greaves that covered her feet, but she had a problem with everything else, or rather the lack thereof. The armored skirt was little more than a wide belt, leaving her in a very revealing metal bikini. The bikini top barely had space for the holy rising sunburst symbol over her heart. This was the official armor that marked her as a paladin, Amy declared, suddenly next to Sue again. Sue blushed and tried to cover herself, but gave up just as quickly. Her small hands just could not cover all that bare skin. "You didn't tell me you were a paladin." "That is so very fortunate." The Saintess could say that, Sue thought, because her outfit wouldn't kill her from sheer embarrassment. Amy was wearing a stylish white and gold dress and matching holy vestment with 5 holy symbols embroidered in gold over her midriff, and a glittering sword on her side. The dress did have a plunging neckline which would have made Sue uncomfortable, but it was far better than what the paladin was currently wearing. "You didn't ask." Sue muttered lamely, shifting her position to use Amy as a shield from the view of the others in the tent. Because Amy had drawn their attention, they were all looking in Sue's direction, which made Sue wish the ground would swallow her up. Amy spun back to those gathered around the table, her golden bracelets tinkling musically as she extended her bare arms. "Paladin Sue has joined our cause," the Saintess announced dramatically, evoking pleased murmurs. "Together we shall defeat the demons that have overrun the country of Felruin and retake Felruin Castle, the home of the traitor Dimitri." The subsequent murmurs lacked enthusiasm, but they did seem enheartened by Amy's words. While Amy was distracted, Sue turned her back on the gathering and tried to log out. "Log out, log out, log out." "Why can't I log out?" Sue muttered. The menu option was there, but it was grayed out. Logging out was disabled, but why? "Buddy system," Amy whispered in Sue's ear, making Sue jump. How was the Saintess so quick on her feet? Amy continued, "Only the party leader can log everyone out. Or you could press the release button on the headset. Oh, you can't because the button is out of reach. Not that you could move your body anyway. I guess you are my +1 for this dance." Saintess Amy gave Paladin Sue a wickedly smug grin. "I haven't forgotten our bargain. You help me, and I will help you. Agreed?" Sue didn't trust Amy even if she held the title of Saintess. But Sue also realized she had little choice. She would cooperate for now and make the best out of a horrible situation. Fighting demons on the side of good didn't sound that bad. Sue nodded her agreement. "Excellent. Let me introduce you to the commanders." Amy grabbed Sue's arm, hugging it tightly to her chest as she forcefully guided Sue to stand next to the table. Sue's attention was taken by the map and pointed markers denoting army positions. Sue assumed they were the blue triangle, while there were many red triangles of varying sizes arrayed all around them. She didn't have to know the numbers to see that it didn't look good. The multiple opposing forces were gathering around their single location. "This is Marcus, Count of Iveria. Thank you for taking time out of your goblin exterminations to join us, Count," Saintess Amy said with hand extended, palm downwards, towards Marcus. Count Marcus went to one knee, bowed and kissed the back of Amy's hand. "The pleasure is all mine, Saintess," he intoned solemnly and gave an imperceptibly small nod to Sue. Amy waved the Count away and whispered to Sue, Marcus worked on the EIC Inner Planets Relay on Mercury before being transferred to Saturn space. He may have heard something about your situation. He pledged his men to our cause after I helped take care of a pesky noble for him. Sue realized the last sentence was about the game, not reality. She had to keep her wit about her, or this may become confusing. Before Sue could ask for further elaboration, Amy dragged Sue to a tall and lanky individual with pointed ears, an elf wearing elegant light leathers and a bow slung over his back. "Are there elves in the Sol system?" Sue whispered to Amy, suddenly unsure. "What? No. Of course not." Amy answered out loud, "This is the leader of our elven regiment, standing 5,000 strong, General Hubert." Hubert bowed, not showing as much deference as Marcus had. More quietly, Amy whispered to Sue, "He's a human from the JRL4 or L5 mining station." For some reason the game turns the taller asteroid miners into elves. They don't have pointed ears in reality. But they do make for amazing archers. In game, I mean. The last of the commanders was a graying man in clerical vestments with a rising sunburst holy symbol emblazoned on his chest. He leant heavily on a staff with a matching half sunburst on the tip, as he gave Amy a wry smile. "Saintus, the sun goddess blesses us with your radiance." Bishop Canterbury. Amy did not sound pleased. "You could have convinced your church to provide more than 5 healers, including yourself." "I do so humbly apologize," the man said annoyingly slowly, though Sue didn't believe he was sorry at all. "As you well know, Saintus, the Pope sent all those he could afford to send on this suicide. I mean, a well-thought-out and righteous campaign." Marcus and Hubert gave the bishop murderous looks. Sue muttered to herself a quote that she had heard somewhere: "Don't worry about gods and demons and their ilk. Worry about the people that believe in them." Sue quickly hid behind Amy when it seemed the bishop would challenge her on what she said. Thankfully Amy jumped in. "Well then," Amy said dangerously sweetly, making the bishop turn pale, "you and your priests will follow the paladin's orders. You will do whatever she says." Before either Sue or Bishop Canterbury could protest, the saintess turned to the table. To the gathering in general she asked, "What are the enemy's numbers? Have the scouts returned?" General Hubert, as the commander of the Elven Scouts, answered, "Their main army, which blocked us at the ravine crossing 3 days ago." He pointed to a place on the map south of the blue triangle that was cresting the northern tip of a huge north-south black void that denoted the ravine. "Has been gathering more forces as they followed us along the other side of the ravine. They are around half a day's journey to the west of our position. Their numbers have swollen to 7,000 heavies, 4,000 dark mags, and 3,000 lopers." "What are heavies and lopers?" Sue asked, unsure of the jargon. She could guess what the dark mags were. Spell casters that dedicated themselves to dark magic like necromancy, demon summoning and statistics. Not that she saw a problem with the last one. Heavies are heavily armored human-like brutes. Surprisingly, it was the bishop that answered. They are demons that wield large and cruel weapons and that enjoy devouring those they defeat in battle. Lopers are more like bulls in build, just as big and stronger than any bull bred for size. They are known for their devastating charge, which could turn into a deadly stampede if enough of them are gathered. So lopers are their cavalry and the heavies are their foot soldiers. Sue nodded as she thought out loud. "So we have 5,000 archers, 5 healers, and how many foot soldiers and cavalry does this army have?" "We are no mere foot soldiers. We are knights," Marcus declared proudly. "How many mounted knights?" Sue asked. "Mounts? Those are for the weak. We are strong," Count Marcus said. "The war horses were lost in a night ambush and the knights refused to use substitutes like camels or emus," the bishop interjected. "How dare you, bishop?" Marcus spat. "Their cowardly attack may have taken our noble steeds, but we ensured those assassins could never attack us again. Do you know how long it takes to train a mount for war? If you did, you would not speak of camels and emus." "As entertaining as your bickering is," Amy said in her dangerously quiet voice that immediately ended the argument, "you, Marcus, did not give the number of your knights." Sue raised an eyebrow at Amy. Why were all these gathered here afraid of her? Amy did kidnap her, so what else was she capable of? 1,000, Marcus said quickly. Could you repeat that, please? Sue blurted, thinking she misheard. 1,000 glorious knights of Iveria, the Count repeated proudly. The army was so obviously outnumbered that Sue didn't know why the army still existed. Retreat. Sue suggested, what about retreating? The ravine could be a temporary barrier to cover their rear, but after that. Retreat is not an option. General Hubert pointed at the vast open plains and rolling hills along their path of retreat. We would have to drive our supply wagons in front of us to prevent them from being taken and slowing us down. The enemy would hound our rear, whittling us down and raising any fallen as undead. The worst outcome is that we would lead their armies into the heart of Allied lands, causing many villages and towns to fall along the way, increasing their numbers even further. If we retreat now, their momentum would move the war to the royal capital and perhaps Centralia would fall. In addition, many in our army have fallen ill from the constant cycle of heat and cold. The healers cannot spare the mana to keep them healthy. Retreat is not an option. While Marcus, Hubert and the bishop wore grim expressions, Amy's wore a wicked grin. Sue guessed that Amy already knew how dire their situation was. She also knew that this game was set up in such a way that there were consequences for losing a kingdom, or so the advertising claimed. The forces of darkness could possibly rule over the entire continent, enslaving all the other races. But why should Sue care if a fictitious world fell? But this was more than just a game world. It was where connections were made. If the world crumbled, Amy would not be able to keep her promise to Sue. Fine. She would help. An elf ran into the tent and whispered something into General Hubert's ear. Hubert announced the news as the red triangles were moved around the map by the elf. The scouts have brought in the latest. There are 3 more groups marching towards the main opposing army. Their numbers are 2,000, 600 and 6,000. Hubert said as he pointed at the new positions of the red triangles. It didn't take a genius tactician to know time was running out. Sue came to the quick realization that the only option was to force a confrontation. General Hubert continued, we must fight them now. We must march out immediately and attack them before it is too late. Out in the open sands of the wastes. Bishop Canterbury scoffed, the lopers alone would crush our army, never mind their heavies and dark mags. You would be marching to your doom. Sue stooped down and picked up a hand of dirt. She let the powdery sand trickle through her fingers onto the map as an idea began to form. She remembered reading up on the magic system before she tried the game the first time. Can your priests cast elemental spells? Sue asked the bishop. Most casters had an affinity for specific elements. Priests usually excelled at light magic that was deemed holy, and the opposite of the dark magic of the dark mags. But there was also the elemental magic, like fire, earth, wind and water, that priests could learn. Yes, of course. The bishop nodded. Sue tipped her hand, letting the rest of the sand fall over the map, covering one of the red triangles. Then the healers won't be used to heal. Instead, this is what we are going to do. Sue explained the plan. There were protests and they were justified. Not having healers against overwhelming odds seemed ludicrous. And yet Sue insisted, 5 healers for an entire army was next to useless anyway. Amy overruled any objections and quashed any dissent. It was not long before the camp packed up and marched to battle. 2532, Arbaland on wastes, fell ruin, UVR. Loun was miserable yet again. What else could he be but miserable as he was stuck in the press of demonic bodies with their thick hides and thorny weapons. Arrows were whizzing over his head, and where they did not find gaps in the demon's thick armor, they bounced off, threatening to strike him from odd angles. But worst of all was the mud. The thick cloying mud that coated everything that touched it. All this time the battle in the mud raged on. Arrows flew, demons waded forward, demons fell. Over and over again. Among the demons, the shorter blacksmith waded through the mud. He wasn't a fighter, but he had somehow been caught up in this mess. He had to move forward too, or be crushed or drowned in the mud. A kind necromancer had said he would raise the dwarf's corpse after the battle if Laun died. Laun wanted to avoid that outcome. He wanted to avoid dying in general. A few days ago he had parted ways with Baama, after promising her he would speak to her again at a later time, after he had found out more about his predicament. In the meanwhile, Laun could not allow any harm to come to the goblins, especially after they treated him so well. It was not long after that two dark mags found him and dragged him along after them. Using Dimitri's name only encouraged the dark mags to keep him and escort the dwarf to the castle for a reward. But in the middle of their journey, the dark mags were summoned to take part in a nearby battle. Or else. So Laun had been dragged along and now he was fighting for his life on a wet and muddy battlefield in the middle of a desert. Whose bright idea was it to water the desert and make his life so much more miserable? The battle had started out well, Laun thought. He had climbed up the back of a loper for a better view to see the two forces lining up between two expansive rock outcroppings with a wide swath of dark soil between. He had thought it was sand then, but knew better now. The land between the rocky outcroppings was protected from the wind, and underneath a thin layer of sand was a fine clay dust. When the land became wet, it turned into a quagmire. A cloying muddy mess that stuck to everything. The opposing army had created lines of sharp earthen stakes, clearly a countermeasure to loper charges, though Laun wasn't sure the lopers knew that. Only the dark mags seemed to have more than 2 brain cells to rub together, and they were cleverly standing well back. The demons were restless, jostling for positions in the front as they would get the most meat, but eventually the demons settled into 3 lines of heavy foot in the center with the casters behind them. 2 groups of 500 lopers each formed the vanguards with another 1,000 positioned behind those. There was not space for all the demons on the battlefield, so the remainder formed a milling mass of unofficial reserves behind the dark mags. Suddenly a loper, the one Laun happened to be sitting on, grew impatient, and charged towards the opposing army. Laun was thrown from the loper's back. One after another, other lopers realized something was happening and joined in the fray. What should have been a single stampede of thousands of lopers, dwindled to a charge of a few hundred. The lopers' progress was hampered by the thick mud, but still they came on at impressive speeds, plowing through the sticky dirt and sending globules splattering every which way. By the time they reached the first stakes, they had lost enough momentum to impale themselves on the sharpened fortifications instead of barreling through them. The enemy did not sit idle. After the lopers began their charge, the archers began to fire their arrows. The lopers had thick armor on their bodies and heads, but on their limbs the armor was much thinner. The elves aimed for the front legs, especially the joints, and many lopers stumbled and fell into the mud once a limb was pierced. The lopers behind crushed the ones that fell before them into the mud, pressing the fallen forms so deeply into the mud that they could not extract themselves. The foot demons howled their battle cries and charged forward only to find their progress severely hampered by the mud. This was where Laun found himself, swept up in their failed charge. They stumped through, under heavy archer fire. A few wielded shields, but they were too few to cover all the demonic soldiers. While many fell, the tide of demons still surged forward, but by the time they had reached the stakes, where some impaled lopers were still being kicked off by the enemy knights, the demons were exhausted. The demons in front fell quickly to the expert swings of the swords. As the dead piled up at the battle line, the demon heavies in the back were still eager to join the fray and pushed their brethren forward. The demons were so tightly packed that they could barely swing a weapon, making them easier pickings for the archers. Not that they were easy. Just like the lopers, the demons had heavy armor on their bodies and heads, except for their eyes. So the demons kept their heads down to protect their eyes from the rain of arrows. Some arrows still found their mark, adding to the death toll. It had taken a while for them to get organized, but eventually the dark mags ceased arguing among themselves and formed their lines. They began to lob spells over the heads of the advancing demons, but the death-dealing spells struck against a golden dome and dissipated harmlessly. The saintess smiled as she stood with arms raised above her head, holding her sword aloft, causing the golden magical dome that covered their 6,000-strong army to glow with power. Even from where he was stuck in the mud, Laun could see the saintess's mirth. So this was the power of the saintess. The magic battle overhead was one of attrition where the first to falter would fall. The Saintess had to keep her sword up and keep the dome of protection, or their forces would be defenseless against the purple and green magical projectiles bombarding them. Either the dark mags would run out of mana or she would. She grit her teeth as the battle continued. At first it had been simple to maintain the dome with her raised sword, but as the hour turned to 2, it looked as if she was faltering, like she was holding up the sky, and the sky was becoming heavier and heavier as time passed. She didn't look like she would last much longer. Then a paladin was next to her, and with a touch, a golden light enveloped the Saintess and visibly washed away all the fatigue that had been accumulating over the battle. The Saintess once again stood tall. This show of defiance inspired the army around her, which fought with renewed vigor. A cry of "Lopers are attacking the baggage train" came from the other side of the human and elven army. The supply wagons were far back from the fight, so they were well out of sight, but if those were destroyed, even if the knights won, they would starve to death. Meanwhile, behind Laun, some of the dark mags had begun to pass out from lack of mana, slumping onto the ground for a nap. Laun stepped on a corpse of a demon that looked as if it had drowned in the mud. Laun didn't want to drown in the middle of the desert. As arrows whisked over his head, he saw ahead of him lay 3 large piles of demon bodies, fallen as they were killed before the other army's defenses. The middle one was the closest and also was where a golden light of the Saintess was streaming from. It also happened to be the direction he was being corralled towards. He had promised to Bahama that he wouldn't use it, but he had to. As long as it didn't kill anyone, it should be fine, right? Laun summoned the sword and the weapon swung itself in an arc above Laun's head. An arrow that would have pierced his left cheek disappeared in a puff of black smoke. It was only after it had happened that he jerked with surprise. He had almost died, but his sword had protected him, which made Laun feel much better for calling it out when he did. Laun crouched as low as he could without sinking into the mud, not wanting to chance his sword saving him a second time. Laun stumbled forward, and before long he was at the edge of the curtain of light. He swung, and his sword connected with that golden dome, causing lightning to strike it and dark cracks to run over the dome's surface. Then the dome exploded. Laun remained standing more because the mud held him in place than of his own volition. That was until a purple lightning bolt struck and exploded next to him, launching him out of the mud and landing him on the growing pile of corpses. After a few more pops of distant explosions, the rain of mage fire stopped. The dark mages had completely run out of mana. 2532, Arbaland on Wastes, Fell Ruin, UVR. Amy was ecstatic. Arm-achingly tired, but ecstatic. She felt so powerful, keeping an entire army of dark mags at bay just by pointing her blade at the sky to keep the dome of holy light in place. The same blade she had used to slay demons in Centralia Castle, which had been the first step to increasing her fame. As the battle continued, she felt in her bones that she would win and her fame would leap upwards once more. It was all thanks to Sue's plan to annihilate the demonic forces. The heavies' corpses piled on top of each other, peppered by elven arrows, while they had barely lost any of their own forces. Sue had warned if there were flying enemies, their defense would have crumbled. But there weren't any. The maze-like jagged and irregular rock outcropping on their sides kept the elven archers safe from any flanking maneuvers by the Lopers. Any heavy demon that attempted to climb the precarious rock piles were picked off and the main forces streamed down the center, into the quagmire where they perished. Through the press of demon bodies she saw a lone dwarf. Though the small form was barely recognizable as a dwarf since it was covered in mud from head to toe. It was strange enough that a dwarf was fighting alongside the demons, but what interested her more was the dwarf's attempt at charging in with his own muddy sword raised. She expected the dwarf to fill with arrows at any moment. But that moment didn't come. As the dwarf's sword struck the dome, Amy was forced to her knees. Purple lightning arced through the sky and coursed downwards towards Amy, but Sue jumped in the way and was struck instead. The paladin was flung to the side, her body smoking. With surprised shock, Amy watched her dome, her power that she had kept up for close to 3 hours, crack and shatter until nothing remained. Anger gripped her. It was impossible. How dare he? He must be using a cheat, because there was no power in the game greater than hers. Amy climbed slowly to her feet and stumbled to the motionless Sue, tendrils of smoke still curling around the unmoving paladin. The saintess stood over the paladin and ordered, "Get up." Sue lay motionless before groaning and slowly rising to her feet. Amy hefted her weapon into the air and the soldiers around them raised a victory shout as the remaining demon reserves, which still numbered in the thousands, turned and fled. They had lost their appetite for battle. As the soldiers roared and celebrated their victory, Amy felt that all too familiar euphoric feeling. The one she played UVR to experience over and over again. She felt amazing, and she recognized that Sue had played a pivotal part in making all this happen. When she had found Sue, she had been curious if by breaking the android piece by piece she could reach that same height as she felt in UVR, but now she wanted to keep Sue. Sue would be Amy's toy for the foreseeable future. Victory is ours, and the saintess began, but then the world disappeared. Amy saw a screen which read "Logging out. Thank you for playing UVR." A shock of alarm coursed through Amy. She hadn't initiated the logout, and Sue was in no position to activate the forced logout, because her head was far removed from her body. That could only mean someone had broken into her apartment. High above the battlefield, a single flying figure, a humanoid silhouette with bat-like wings, hovered. The pale vampire in noble's clothes swung his cane and, under the brim of his top hat, tapped his chin thoroughly while he watched events unfold below him. Baron Nicholas Dimitri's lips curled into a smile as he said to himself, "Interesting." Please like and comment about what you liked or disliked in the story. Subscribe if you would like to hear more. Thank you for your support.